Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much to the Cambridge University and the London Center for organizing this conference. I wish we could all meet in person, but hopefully we're almost out of the woods and this will happen pretty soon. So here I am going to give you my paper from the trees, from the mango trees of Florida. It could be worse. So I'm Dr. Frédéric Conrod. I'm an associate professor of comparative literature at Florida Atlantic University. I teach courses on literature, on film, on literary theory at the undergraduate and the graduate level. My research is mostly on visual cultures, and especially on 20th and 21st literary theories related to early modernity of Spain and France, with a particular focus on the rise of the Jesuit order as a turning point and significant factor for the development of theater and the novel and its projection in the present. So today, instead of giving you a traditional paper that's pretty much coming to be a finished product, I'm going to be completely on the other side of the spectrum and be honest about it. This is a project that has been with me for a long time. The questions that I'm trying to answer in this project have been um, with me for at least a couple decades. So the questions are old. The answers yet are still, in the works. So what I'm proposing to do here with this very long, somewhat long title of Hombre, claro, the relativity of clarity and the narcissistic art of Engaño in modern day Spanish culture is kind of to look at the connections that I've established before in previous work between the Baroque period and the present. So, but not only that, right? I want to bring it in the picture a lot of cultural psychology, which is a relatively new discipline. So, since the Baroque period, Spanish culture has reflected on the art of engaño, which we could translate as deceit, in its hardly translatable counterpart, el desengaño, right? So, which of course has been translated as disenchantment. In the present, the same reference to the art of blurring any situation of clarity exists in a culture that often perceives its social interaction of all kinds, from the professional to the sentimental, in terms of mirrors, optical illusions, reflections, projections, and distortions. With centuries of Catholic heritage in its history, as well as internal cultural differences and competitive complexes drawn from the still recent traumatic experience of 4 decades of dictatorship, Spanish culture might be showing signs of a narcissistic culture disorder, which affects its media, its politics, and its will to project a modern identity. In an effort to connect the cultural narcissism that often characterizes the Spaniards from the perspective of stereotype to the present day systems of make believes, this overview of a larger book project seeks to understand how and in which parameters Spanish culture permits or enables its nationals to blur clarities of education, status, ethnicity, and sexuality in order to project themselves in a narcissistic contemplation. Clarity is the worst enemy of the subject in a diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder. A culture that has been supportive and has relied on the relativity of clarity through optical plays and illusions can also be a culture that envisions its narcissistic attitude to be mastered as an art. This project will therefore discuss whether this is the case of modern Spanish culture or not. Although, of course, first of all, before I go any further, let me open this discussion of this rather large book project with a disclaimer. before we get any further, and hear about a cultural pathological pattern that I've been seeking to identify, right? Narcissism lays at the base of dozens of other cultures, not only the Spanish culture, obviously, right? And they can be identified in other culture as a much bigger monster. Um, so the culture of constantly feeding superlatives to the people, the symptom par excellence of grandiose narcissism, has reached its unthinkable heights in the United States under the presidency of Donald Trump, himself a symptom rather than cause of the ever growing admiration of the self in capitalist societies. That doesn't mean everybody in the capitalist society is a narcissist. Obviously, I'm not going in that direction at all. And there are narcissism in counterpart communist or socialist scenarios as well. So it's not my goal to make this, so much a clear symptom of capitalist society, right? Although Spanish culture remains very modest in comparison to what's going on in the US, and now has enough historical distance to contemplate the shallowness of past superlatives, such as the world's greatest empire it once was, rather the grandiose, the narcissism Spain's culture, my shelter, is more of a covert nature, right? So here we would be talking about covert narcissism in the case of Spain rather than grandiose narcissism. Covert narcissism is very hard to detect at first in the individuals who are affected by this pathology, as they expose a rather open minded, liberal, educated, and charming personality to seduce the empathic victims they will end up using as narcissistic supply, which is the reason why I'm using this title, Hombre Claro, no? Because this Hombre Claro, depending how it's pronounced, can be a message of conciliation, of acceptance, right? Hombre Claro, right? Or it could be an Hombre Claro, which is more an imposition of belief or opinion. So there's a very thin line between the message that Hombre Claro carries in Spain depending on how it's pronounced. Talking about cultural narcissism and displacing a psychological condition onto a group of people, anywhere from a family to an entire nation, is not an endeavor to be taken lightly. What psychology has identified as conditions, since its confirmation as a discipline by Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century, has been strictly restricted to the realm of the individual. Cultural psychology, on the other hand, is yet to affirm itself as a recognized and respected field of study. As Stephen J. Heinle sums up in, in cultural psychology, his main work so far, and I quote, cultural psychology as a field is still a relatively new discipline, and it continues to produce striking evidence that challenges psychologists' understanding of human nature. In contrast to much conventional wisdom, this field has been revealing that culture shapes how people's minds operate, sometimes in profound ways. The past couple of decades have been an exciting time as an abundance of research continues to demonstrate that culture is not just a thin veneer covering the universal human mind. Rather, this research has shown just how deeply cultural influences penetrate our psychology and shape the ways we think. The research underscores how human thoughts occur within cultural contexts and shows that different cultural contexts can lead to fundamentally different ways of thinking. End of quote. My personal interest in for digging deeper into the psychological condition of that particular culture, which I'm not officially a member, comes from my experience in attempting to become one and the challenges I was not able to overcome as product of other cultural psychological parameters and conditions. Transculturalism is not always a successful process, but it still is a realization of one's capacities and will to engage with another culture's psychology without it being familiar at first. And as in any individual or culture, psychology teaches us there is a surface and then a larger part of the floating iceberg underneath that line, which separates the visible from the invisible. And that's an image by Freud, not by me, obviously. Yet over the years, a series of questions have arisen through the works of a variety of scholars and my own around the possibility of a deeply and rooted covert narcissism at the core of Spain's supposedly transformed and modernized culture in the 21st century. Any foreigner who has a sufficient exposure to the unifying culture of the Spanish kingdom, although it constantly stresses its regional cultural differences to cover it, has come to be aware of many points of double morality and contradictory behaviors that make the old Franco touristic propaganda phrase of Spain is different, or the Holy Trinity of siesta, fiesta, paella be questioned very seriously. What often lays below this image of an overly enthusiastic land of leisure, recreation, and delightful sensorial and culinary experiences can turn out to be an extremely disenchanting realization that it covers up depressive tendencies, physical exhaustion from unregulated work conditions, and very unhealthy and or risky practices ranging from drug consumption to sex addiction all over Spanish culture. Indeed, deceitful and disenchanting is the moment of realization once the iceberg is becoming total. Um, with century of Catholic heritage and its history, again, as I mentioned, it is a challenge um, to become this clear-cut, clear message-driven nation. Clarity is the worst enemy of the subject in a diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder, as I've mentioned before. Obviously, Spain cannot be blamed for being the only country whose culture practices deceptive narcissism, among many others, and many other forms of engaños that can be indexed. Nietzsche wrote in his essay on truth and lie in a non-moral sense in 1873 that, quote, the art of dissimulation reaches its peak in men. Here, deception, flattery, lying and cheating, talking behind the back of others, keeping up appearances, living in borrowed splendor, donning masks, the shroud of convention, play acting before others and before oneself, in short, the continual fluttering around the flame of vanity is so much the rule and the law that virtually nothing is as incomprehensible as how an honest and pure drive to truth could have arisen around among men. End of quote. As we shall see, what is identified as universal here by the German philosopher as particular development in the psychology of a geographically isolated nation with a Roman Catholic heritage and a history of terminated colonization. Fallen empires have to cope in different ways and the heavy narcissism that we find in the generation of 1898 is an initial sign that Spain overcomes this episode of ego reduction by a narcissistic compensation in its artistic productions as well. In the 20th century, from Salvador Dali to Pedro Almodóvar, the country sees a series of initially creative figures turning into trademarks, brands, phenomena that find their root in historical traumatic moments when individuals belonging to a society agree implicitly that some of them will receive these marks of distinctions and worshiping and branding for the greater good of the entire culture. For the foundation of this project, and as a way of introducing its scopes in an introductory chapter, I would like to isolate three particular episodes in Spanish history precisely that are responsible, in my opinion, for the narcissistic attitudes noticeable in the cultural behaviors in modern Spain. First, the ethnic, cultural, and religious cleansing that happens between the 15th and the 16th centuries, and the promoted ideas of a pureza de sangre, a purity of blood. Second, as I just mentioned before, the conquest, the rise of the empire and its fall, and the agony and experience of agony in the 19th century at the end. Third, the experience of the longest fascist dictatorship to ever last in Western Europe during the 20th century and in the West in general. Of course, these three significant time periods do not constitute any form of exhaustive list, but there are certainly highlights, turning points in the developmental process of this culture. We are proposing to study through the lens of psychoanalytical claims usually applied to the narcissistic individuals who might derive from it. However, methodology has been applied to other Western cultures, and once again to the United States in particular, that isolate strategies of narcissistic survival in the aftermath of traumatic historical events and time periods. Discussing cultural narcissism began with Christopher Lasch in his well-known The Culture of Narcissism, published in 1979, and now a national bestseller in the US in 2020 for the vision, almost the prophecy of the Trump years it had predicted 41 years ago. Although we cannot find a Spanish equivalent of such a questioning of one's own culture in Spain, we can very well find inspiration in the establishment of parallels between the US and Spain. As Lasch offers proposals in this book that are universal, even if essentially focused on the American narcissistic attitudes, they still have some kind of value for other nations of the West. Even though his work is focused on the future of the United States from the perspective that the 1970s might have had of a beginning of a 21st century and the rise of narcissism in the culture, Lasch points to some key ideas that could very well be applied to Spain from a different angle, and this is the kind of work I would like to do in this book, particularly in his identification of what it defines as the new narcissist, and how this prototype for our century in the Western world is, quote, superficially relaxed and tolerant, which once again makes us wonder what this hombre claro that we hear so much in Spanish conversation, what this hombre claro attitude contain of traditional rigidity disguised in a somewhat modern and progressive overall message. So obviously, this is a big project, and I thank you very much for your feedback, your comments, and especially for listening to me during this past 20 minutes. Have a great day.